But according to that definition, Elon Musk is on the far right. Father Calvin Robinson is on the far right. You probably are too. But Paul Brand wasn't finished. He posted on X exclusive data shows a 327% rise in far-right activity during summer riots. ITV Tonight has quantified the surge in social media traffic as one former senior police officer tells us that the far right has been underestimated. What absolute... Where is the Paul Brand investigation into the real threat, the provable threat of Islamism extremism? You won't find the most important newsflash of the day anywhere within the corrupt MSM. But you know, I have been reporting for weeks that we have not been told the full truth about the so-called riots in the wake of the Southport Massacre, which were used by two-tier care as a way to bludgeon the white working classes into terrified silence. It was always abundantly clear to me that many of the major instigators and agitators were hard-left activists, many connected to Antifa, who were desperate to stir up tension and then pin the blame on the social media users expressing genuine horror about the deadly stabbing of 3 beautiful young girls at a Taylor Swift dance class. Today, the very tip of the iceberg was revealed in a bombshell court case that the vast majority of the legacy media has chosen to ignore, even though they went wall to wall on the jailing of pensioner housewives who made inartful Facebook posts. But this is much more sinister. Much more. This is Ehsan Hussein. But during the unrest, he used the fake name Chris Nolan on social media in a deliberate bid to try and cause hatred and violence against his own ethnic group. Now, credit to the Daily Telegraph, one of the only outlets that has actually reported the details from court alongside the Daily Mail. So let me read them to you. Ehsan Hussein, 25 years old, used the name to post messages calling for disorder that spread across Britain. The messages appeared on a Telegram chat group called Southport Wake Up, which had more than 12,000 members. Screenshots of the messages obtained by the police show Hussein urging people to conquer Alam Rock, a predominantly Muslim neighborhood, stating, "Sick of these smelly scumbags." Other racist messages, Hussein's contribution to a conversation he had with 2 other users, included, quote, "We've got a blues match on Saturday. We can do a part 2 on Saturday. Get these P-word scums out." He also wrote, "Birmingham first, we need to take back what's ours, and we're doing P-word bashing." Hussein from Yardley pleaded guilty at Birmingham Magistrates Court to contributing threatening, abusive, or insulting written material intending to stir up racial hatred between August the 3rd and August the 6th. Now, you might remember what happened in Yardley. There was indeed an assault and criminal damage, which we covered here on Outspoken on August the 5th. So this was a false flag operation in place. And my belief is it was far bigger than just Ehsan Hussein. But will we ever get to the bottom of it? Sadly unlikely, given it doesn't fit the establishment and media narrative. As Chris Rose posted on X, hope he receives a similar sentence to the white working class people he was trying to provoke. Otherwise, others could just say that they were joking as well. He has been warned he faces jail, but I won't hold my breath. In the meantime, though, the deranged MSM have decided to continue to create a far-right bogeyman in bogus reports. There is no more dishonest actor in the British media than Woke ITV News or its over-promoted loser Paul Brand, who devoted an entire show to it last night. Now, I'm going to show you parts of it just so you can see how hysterical and removed from reality this is.
vehicle was threatening to engulf surrounding buildings. Restaurant owner Lookman feared for the lives of local residents. He believes the rioters' objective was to terrorise the local community.
I think they just wanted to set an example that we have to live under constant fear. I think they have gone beyond cruelty in order to cause our businesses, our lives, our properties in general, people from ethnic minority backgrounds, the fear. And now I can definitely tell you, people are living in constant fear.
Vehicle.
There was a lot more too about the social
Experts
origins.
agree that the shape of the far right in Britain has changed markedly in recent years.
If you think about the 90s, you had far-right groups who had a leader, they'd go to the pub, have their weekly meetings, pay their fees. That doesn't really happen anymore. What happens more and more is you have these very decentralised online far-right networks where anyone can join, anyone can share their ideology, anyone can mobilise.
Despite this, there are certain threads that tie far-right activists together.
It's about either British culture or white people being replaced by people, as they would see it, from an alien culture. But it's this idea that basically multiculturalism in Britain is failed and it's in crisis, and we're heading, in some cases on the more extreme end, they believe we're heading towards some sort of civil war.
At 1:59 a.m. on August the 5th.
Now, you know, in my opinion, you're not far right to say multiculturalism has failed. You're dead right. But according to that definition, Elon Musk is on the far right. Father Calvin Robinson is on the far right. You probably are too. But Paul Brand wasn't finished. He posted on X, exclusive data shows a 327% rise in far-right activity during summer riots. ITV Tonight has quantified the surge in social media traffic as one former senior police officer tells us that the far-right has been underestimated. What absolute bullshit. Where is the Paul Brand investigation into the real threat, the provable threat of Islamism extremism? I wish ITV would hire someone like Tom Slater of Spiked Online, who puts all of this into perspective.
To the extent the commentariat is concerned about Islamist terrorism, they only seem concerned that it will fuel a supposedly burgeoning far-right backlash.
IS murdered 3 at that festival in Germany.
When you look at something like this, you just really worry about how it could be used by those on the far right to stir up hatred.
Those riots, egged on by hard right influencers, should horrify anyone who stands against racism and bigotry. Still, it is grotesque to use the real but mercifully small threat posed by the far right to deflect attention away from Islamist extremism, not least because Islamist extremism accounts for the vast majority of the terror threat that we face. Since 2005, 95 people have been killed in Britain in Islamist terror attacks. During that same period, the far right have killed 3 people. Islamist extremism also accounts for 3/4 of MI5's terrorism caseload, but you wouldn't get that impression from the mainstream media.
So well done, Tom Slater, for a truly balanced and factual report. And it's that transparency which is why outlets like Spiked Online and Outspoken are thriving, while the MSM, like Woke ITV and Sly News, die a long, slow, and propaganda-filled death. Now let me bring in today's superstar panel. And I'm delighted to be joined once again by the rising star of Reform UK, Mayuran Sentilnathan, and making her Outspoken debut, the brilliant Molly Kingsley, a lawyer, parent, campaigner, and the force behind the incredible Us for Them, a pressure group which bravely pushed back against the devastating impact of COVID lockdowns on children. Great to have you both here. So, Mayuran, what do you make of this bombshell court case today?
I think what it's showing is, let's go back to what you were talking about, your monologue, because unless we define the term far right, this whole conversation, this whole discussion about the riots becomes meaningless. I mean, Lee Anderson got up in the House of Commons and asked Angela Rayner a very simple question. Can you give me a definition of Islamophobia? and she gave a complete non-answer. Yet Islamophobia is going to be passed into legislation somehow. People are going to get accused of crimes, may even get sentences. And the same thing is happening with the term far right. We don't know what this term means. When you have mass immigration, when you have illegal immigration, when you have a society changing as fast as it is changing now, and people have concerns about that, at what point do they start becoming far right? If the government is going to use terms like this, if the media are going to say things like far right activity has increased 327%, if they're going to make these claims, you have to, it is imperative, you define clearly in legislation, bit by bit, in precise detail, what does far right mean. But in terms of this court case, it is a signal to say there is a blind spot. I mean, I think you might say it's a lot more than a blind spot in the whole narrative of how these riots have been formed. I think what I would class as far right is the kind of Nazi saluting, swastika bearing individual, which I think makes up an absolute tiny minority of the British population. And of course, they may hijack certain legitimate protests and you may get violence spewing over. But I think there is a blind spot of the Islamist threat, and you brought up Tom Slater there, he brought up the idea that MI5, 3/4 of their caseload is Islamist terrorism. I think we've lost sight of that. We've amplified far right terrorism, extremism, and we've broadened the term to almost mean to a point of meaninglessness, and we've dwarfed the term, and we're ignoring the idea of Islamist extremism as well. And I think that's the real problem that we're seeing here.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you on that, Mayuran. Absolutely, without any doubt. But Molly Kingsley, great to have you here, by the way, for the first time. Lovely to see you.
Thank you, Dan.
Can we just talk about this specific case with Ehsan Hussein? Because he's pled guilty, he's admitted it, he has made it clear that he doesn't actually feel that way. I mean, it's his own ethnic group that he's talking about. So it seems very clear to me that there was a false flag operation going on to try and stoke violence, to try and anger the locals in Southport.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think the key thing here is the law has to be applied equally, regardless of someone's background or the label we apply or is applied to them. Actually, if someone has stoked violence, then they ought to be, meted out with the same punishment, regardless of whether they are far right, nothing, far left. In a way, it's not relevant to what they've done. And I think, as Mayuran said, I'm very concerned, having spent a lot of the last 3 or 4 years, being labelled a far right extremist. I think it is a really, really problematic phrase. It's a label that's lost any kind of bearing to reality. And of course, the use of that label and other labels like it is intended to delegitimize and to devalue, in some cases, legitimate concerns, I believe.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. And the thing is, Mayuran, people are very concerned about two-tier justice, right? And it clearly is going on. I mean, we've seen so many examples of it. But I guess for me, this is a slightly different case because the judge today made it absolutely clear that this guy is going to go to jail. But what I'm more interested in is what were his motivations? Why was he spreading all of this racist stuff in the Southport group? Because if you look at, for example, the Black Lives Matter riots across the US in 2020, and then the sort of counter protests that followed, Antifa would very often go undercover within those counter protests to try and stoke violence and make it look as if it was the quote-unquote far right that was responsible for it. And I believe there is Antifa operating in this country doing a similar thing.
Yeah, so what extremists do, whether you're far right, and I mean that in a true sense of the term, or you're an Islamist extremist, is you try and create a grievance narrative, and then through a grievance narrative, you create a victimhood, and through victimhood, you create rage and a sense of strength in your identity and your tribalism, and then that spills over into actual violence and extremism. And I think what Antifa are good at, and I think what the Islamist and what this case shows is an attempt to create a grievance narrative. So if you can stoke violence, incite people, get them angered, get them rageful, then what happens is your own group, that is in this case, I'm guessing the kind of Islamist Muslim gang that in Birmingham, you mobilize them, you strengthen their identity, you give them a grievance, you give them a narrative, a sense of victimhood, and that Islamist us versus them, believer versus unbeliever, starts to become more defined, and it strengthens your position. And that's how extremism works generally across the spectrum. But I think we're seeing this case play out in this particular court case.
Of course we are. Of course we are. And Molly, what do you think overall about the unrest in the country at the moment?
Oh, I mean, where to start? It's just very depressing, isn't it? Because it speaks to a country in what feels to be almost terminal decline. And, you know,
Yes.
as a parent, that is really depressing. And actually, for the first time, so we were in Australia for a few weeks over summer, which was fantastic with the kids. And for the first time in my life, we looked at this other place and thought, is it time to move our family there? You know, what is there in the UK for our children growing up? And
so many people are thinking
part
about
of
that. I mean,
me-
we're going to be talking later in the show, actually, about Charlie Mullins, who has done just that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, you know, when you come back, and in fact, it was as the riots, I think, broke out the day that we flew back into the country, and I remember seeing the paper for the first time in 4 or 5 weeks and just thinking, this is just so depressing. And actually, the element of it that I find particularly depressing, because, you know, Dan, I feel very similarly to you about mainstream media, very let down on both a kind of personal, professional level. And the need to keep stoking this unrest, which I think mainstream media are really guilty of. They're very guilty of, you know, fomenting this never-ending tribalism. And actually, most people just want to get on with their lives. They want quiet lives. They want to go to work. They want to make ends meet, and they want to raise their kids in a peaceful, happy country. And I don't think that's where we are as a country
and they
now.
want
And it is
to be
really,
safe.
really saddening to see.
Yeah, they want to be safe. It is interesting, Molly, actually, because I have to be honest, the past few weeks, I've had a very similar feeling to some of the despair I felt in 2020 and 2021 during the COVID pandemic, when I just felt like so far removed from what I was hearing in the mainstream media. And while I do believe the majority are with me, the silent majority are with me, it can be a very isolating experience, can't it, when the entire political establishment is against you, the entire mainstream media is against you, the Uni Party, Labour and the Conservatives against you. It's easy to be despondent, I guess.
It really is. I mean, and I've got, you know, having gone from a point of writing, you know, weekly, twice weekly for mainstream media in the sort of height of the pandemic, then obviously the whole censorship experience, I've gone to the point now where I almost can't bear to pick up a newspaper, because I look at it and I think it's either this, you know, tribal inflammatory rhetoric, or it's lies, outright lies and propaganda, or it's just a failure to report the really key stories. And yet we complain, and media complains about the mess the country is in. Well, if we can't start having honest conversations and asking the right questions, what hope do we have to fix any of this?
And you're so right. So much of the media bias, and Mayuran, I'm interested for your view on this, but so much of it comes by omission, by story selection. So, for example, you would see the British Bashing Corporation, Woke ITV, Channel 4 News, Sly News lined up outside the courtrooms when the likes of poor Julie Sweeney and Lucy Connolly, white working class women who made an artful social media post, were being sent down for 18 months. But when it comes to this man today, no TV cameras, not one iota of coverage anywhere on the broadcast media. So very often it's about what stories they try to amplify. But first, it's the best time of year. Football is back. We're talking Premier League in the UK and in the US, NFL Sundays and college football Saturdays. With that comes the glorious grind of fantasy football lineups, where your inner manager comes alive, setting perfect fantasy rosters, screaming at your TV. You know what it's like. But listen, while you're over here making sure your fantasy team is dialed in, don't let your personal grooming become the guy that gets left on the bench. Because let's be honest, no one wants to fumble their grooming routine. That's where Manscaped's Performance Package 5.0 Ultra comes in, acting as your all-in-one grooming playbook. From keeping things sharp down below with the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra to taking care of those rogue ear and nose hairs with the Weed Whacker 2.0, this is the lineup that'll keep you looking and feeling like a champ on and off the field. It'll help you feel clean, confident, and ready to dominate your fantasy league. So, the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra Groin and Body Hair Trimmer is the franchise player of your grooming roster. With precise trimming capabilities, it's reliable, efficient, and gets the job done without fumbling. Whether it's for date night, a weekend tailgate, or just everyday grooming, this is the tool you want on your squad. No one wants a surprise ear or nose hair making a guest appearance on game day, so the Weed Whacker 2.0 handles those details like a pro, keeping you neat and ready to go. No missed tackles in your grooming game. Also today comes with 2 free gifts. How can you resist this? The Boxers 2.0 Midnight Bravo and the Shed 2.0 Toiletry Bag. Premium gear to ensure you're always ready for action, whether at home or on the road. So join the over 10 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped. I'm one of them. And get ready for kickoff by heading over to manscaped.com. Use the coupon code Outspoken and you will get 20% off and free shipping as well. So let me repeat that, www.manscaped.com. When you go to checkout, you just type in Outspoken and you'll get 20% off your entire order as well as free shipping. This is an incredible deal. Stay on top of your grooming game and be ready for anything the season throws your way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. If you look at Lockdown is the classic case. It's the case study that we should all be looking at. It should be taught in schools and universities how this all played out. We had a BBC simply plummeting over and over again, daily figures of dying with COVID or of COVID, who cares? It's just a number, scaring people into submission, nudging people into fear. There was only one narrative, lockdown or lockdown harder and for longer. There was no impact assessment, no cost benefit analysis. And that was our state broadcaster, our impartial news reporting that was going on. Yet lockdown was probably one of the biggest, most catastrophic policies of government in modern times. If we look at something like net zero, do we ever talk about the real cost and the real implications of net zero? It's never talked about on the BBC. So it's exactly what you're saying, omission. It's not just about reporting, it's omission. There are huge gaping black holes, not the £22 billion black hole, but the other black holes in media, in reality, that are simply not being noted by our BBC, the BBC that we should be trusting with our news. And so that's why people are up in arms.
It's very interesting, actually, that you mentioned those subjects, Mayuran, because I was speaking to a very senior figure, shall we say, in your party, Reform UK, just yesterday, actually, who said to me, come the next election, 2 issues are going to matter to the public: nut zero, as I call it, and immigration. And I think it's true. I think we know the immigration issue is there at the moment, but when it comes to nut zero, it's something that is still this broad establishment consensus, but not with the people, because we don't want to be bankrupt by it. And actually, breaking right now, I want to show you this bombshell new poll from More in Common, which actually, this is what gives me faith, guys. This is what gives me faith in the British public, because the establishment, the mainstream media might be evil, but the people are good. So this is the first voting intention since the general election. It was published in today's Politico playbook, but this is according to Luke Trull, who's behind the polling. Labour, down 6%, but look at the slump since the election. 29%. That puts the Conservatives just 4 points behind on 25%. But look at the surge from Reform UK. Now, clearly, the big opposition force with 18%, the Lib Dems 14%, Green 8%, and the SNP on 3%. And as Zia Yousaf, the chairman of Reform UK, posted on X, Reform is winning support from Labour at great speed. This is just 2 months post an election. They won. Imagine what a few years will do. No wonder Starmer is petrified. But Myron, it's not just Labour who should be petrified, is it? The Conservatives stalling, really, and the big beneficiary from this complete lack of faith in Labour as a result of so many terrible decisions. But I think you'd particularly say the early release of the prisoners in order to lock up social media criminals, and also the removal of the winter fuel allowance for pensioners, has just created so much disharmony in such early days for Slippery Starmer.
Yeah, Starmer has effectively broken his contract with the British people. He started off with the riots. As soon as you label anybody concerned about immigration as far right, he's basically broken his contract with the working class people, with the Red Wall. As soon as you start taking away winter fuel payments to vulnerable pensioners, you break your contract with the elderly. And at the same time, we have prisoners being released early. And we have police not really prosecuting anyone who commits petty crime. So again, you start to realize as a citizen, am I the mug for actually abiding by the law? And so this is what's happening. The grumblings are happening that what on earth am I doing here? We'll talk later perhaps about the exodus of millionaires. We also have to talk about people where it pays to be on welfare rather than actually get a job. And so you start to realize the whole shift and dynamic of how society and the state should work is slowly breaking apart. And so that's what I mean by the social contract is becoming more and more redundant. At the same time, Keir Starmer has formed alliances with the unions, trying to form alliance with the unions, I'd say, and he's also chosen the Muslim vote when he chooses to stop arms to Israel, and so you start to see that he's forming alliances here and he's breaking contracts there, and it's proving to be deeply unpopular with the electorate.
And he's also lying, by the way, because the fake £22 billion black hole, which doesn't exist, the lie that it was Liz Truss who crashed the economy, when we all know it was shutting down the economy for 2 years and printing money and operating a furlough scheme for a virus that actually wasn't going to kill the vast majority of the country. That's what crashed the economy. Molly, where do you stand on the state of politics at the moment? Is there something about Reform UK that excites you? Can you get behind Farage?
I think it's a very interesting time. And I think, I think Mayuran was exactly right when he said we've just lived through a period. Well, it will be part of the history books, but it's notable for containing the worst policy decisions, I think, of modern times, and also the most expensive. And I think that leads to real problems for both of the mainstream parties. Obviously, you had, the Conservatives broke the country, I think, during the pandemic, but Labour cheered and applauded and lauded that on. So we had this honeymoon period, didn't we?
Harder, longer, remember, Molly? They wanted that.
Yeah, harder, longer, faster, more. And they'll do exactly the same again. And I think the degree of public anger about that period has been radically underestimated by mainstream discourse. I think there are many people for whom, they will quite simply never get over that period. They saw the way their government could act, behave, treat them, take their rights away, and they don't forget. And I think
we'll never be the same again.
And to the same extent, exactly. And I think there is an extent to which Farage and Richard Tyson reform have really benefited from that. I guess what I would say, and it's nothing I've not said certainly to Richard Tyson, who's been a very sort of close friend of the campaign and a real sort of supporter of Us for Them, is that I personally feel there was a moment when they could have benefited more. Actually, I think there are things that happened during lockdown and the pandemic that could have been made into more mainstream political issues. To be fair, I know that Farage has spoken a lot about some of those issues. So certainly things like, leaving the WHO and the kind of corruption around that, I know he's been very, very strong on. And if I was Reform, I would be not relenting on that, because obviously whilst immigration is a huge issue for a very significant number of voters, I think there are other issues which would bring across the people that maybe we're seeing now move. So the disillusioned Labour voters, the disillusioned centrists, the disillusioned families and parents, actually, how do you get those on board? And I think there's a really exciting time for Reform if they are willing to broaden their perspective a little bit to capture those people.
Well, it was interesting. I was speaking to a Conservative politician this morning who lost their seat at the most recent election. And I found this fascinating, Molly. They said coming up on the doorstep was the World Economic Forum. So all of this discussion that actually that's some sort of fringe issue and it's just a far-right conspiracy theory is wrong. People see what's going on as a result of the pandemic. They see what's happened with these globalist authoritarian organizations. And I will just say, I hear what you mean, because you could argue that Reform UK maybe put more focus on the boats and immigration over that time. But all over the pandemic, I was in close touch with Farage, and he was always on the right side of history when it came to the pandemic. And there were not many politicians in this country that I could say that about. So certainly when it came to mandates and lockdowns, you know, you can say he might not have been as loud as he was about stopping the boats, but he certainly was on the right side of history with it.
I absolutely agree with you. And, you know, they were fantastic, and they were very supportive of, you know, us for them from the very first minute, actually, of almost the campaign, and have been since. And they've certainly been head and shoulders above any of the other parties in that respect. Yeah. And I think, you know, when we're looking at a Labour slump now, it's no surprise, is it? Because it's as you said, you know, the uniparty is an overused phrase, but it's just more of the same, and it's more of the same inability to talk to voters, you know, like human beings, and candidly and honestly about the very deep-rooted nature the country faces.
Indeed. And of course, all three of... Oh, sorry, Mayuran, you come in?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think Reform UK, with just 5 MPs in the House of Commons, has been more of an opposition than the Conservative Party.
Big time.
You have Nigel Farage talking about two-tier policing, of course, illegal immigration as well, and the large numbers coming in. You have Richard Tice being absolutely blistering. I mean, asking so many questions about net zero and so on, and steel making, and really holding the government to account. You have Lee Anderson, as I said before, asking about Islamophobia. Even Rupert Lowe, he's really he's offered to take his whole MP salary and donate it to charity in his constituency. That's a phenomenal thing. That's what Reform UK is doing, just with 5 MPs in the House of Commons. Imagine what else could be happening. I mean, out of the about 100 constituencies, Reform UK came second. And so we are hot on the heels of the Labour Party. And even Tony Blair, as soon as Keir Starmer got into power, he wrote a piece saying, beware of reform. Don't neglect that vote, is what he was telling Keir Starmer.
Oh, indeed.
So he's quite nervous about it.
Indeed. They know Reform UK is a danger. What I find chilling and dystopian is that rather than saying, okay, let's have a national conversation about immigration, Starmer has gone down an authoritarian path and is effectively saying, if you even want to have the debate about mass immigration or the invasion of our southern border via the Channel, or why on earth those Southport stabbings could take place, then you are far right and you should be silenced. And there's loads of different ways they are planning to do this. And yesterday I exposed on the show the fact that this new monetization committee is Starmer's attempt to remove Nigel Farage from his broadcast platform, effectively come up with new rules about second jobs. That will mean he is booted, he is sacked from GB News. Well, last night on GB News, Nigel Farage responded in the strongest of terms.
And today, Lucy Powell, who is leader of the House, has set up a new committee, a new modernisation committee. When you hear that word, you should always have a slight shiver down the spine. And she herself, unusually, is going to chair this committee. It has 14 members, 9 of them are Labour. And I tell you what they're really going for. They're talking about second jobs, but in particular, what they're talking about is broadcasting. And it says the committee will consider what advantages, if any, outside paid engagement, such as media appearances, journalism and speeches furnished to the public versus potential conflicts of interest. Well, folks, I want to tell you this. I don't see any conflict of interest between being an MP and coming here 3 evenings a week for an hour. And by the way, if there are crucial votes, I just won't be here. I don't see any conflicts of interest whatsoever. In fact, I might make an argument that's slightly different, that I'm here with a panel of people. Some agree with me, some disagree with me. We have open debate. I'd like to think that through programmes like this, what we actually do is take what's really happening in politics and bring it to a bigger audience. So I think it's complementary. So all I can say to Lucy Powell is this really affects Lee Anderson and myself. And if you're coming after us and think you can bully us, you've picked on the wrong people. I'm not going anywhere. If you want to martyr me, please have a go.
There he goes. Now, look, I think we probably know what Mayuran thinks about this one. So, Molly Kingsley, what do you reckon? Should Nigel Farage be allowed to continue to broadcast on TV News, earning a 7-figure salary for doing so, even though he's a serving MP working for the people of Clacton?
Honestly, as long as the same rule applies to all MPs, I don't have an issue with it. I mean, I guess the thing I would say is personally, I think MPs should be paid more. I think the dearth of good quality politicians is one of the reasons we are in such a mess as a country. The thing, though, that I am far more concerned about, he didn't actually talk about it in that clip, but I think he talked about it just before, was the aspect of the news story related to Labour going after him as a broadcaster, which is the fact that Reform MPs can't sit on select committees. Yes. So despite getting more votes than the Lib Dems, they have been banned from either chairing or having MPs on select committees. I find that so sinister and invidious, because actually, if you look, and I have read far too many select committee transcripts over the last few years. And the thing that strikes me is that one of the real failings of our democracy and the kind of checks and balances that obviously all went out of the window during the pandemic, and disastrously so for us, but one of the real failings was the fact these select committees did not do their job. They became an organ of the uni party. The MPs lacked backbone, they lacked teeth, and they didn't have the kind of powers that we're now seeing some of the select committees in America have. And I think Farage and the other Reform MPs could have given a much needed dose of backbone and steel to those select committees. And I'm appalled actually that they're not allowed on them.
Thank you so much for watching Dan Wootton Outspoken. Please do subscribe if you want lots more clips and interviews like that. Plus, if you want to watch our totally uncensored after show, then visit www.outspoken.live.